Okay. Hi, I'm Tim Morris, CFO of Radius, as many of you know. I'm the DEI board sponsor at Radius, and today we've got very exciting, our first live cast on YouTube. And this month's been about a relaunch of our DEI strategy. We've had a lot going on, and what we talked about was ensuring that we provided a platform for key issues for diversity, equality and inclusion. And today is one of those platforms. Throughout November, we started off with our new branded employee resource groups, and we started with an excellent global food cultural tasting induction from our Radius Unity group. In the second week of November, we moved on to Radius Enable, and they kicked off with a podcast. We're upping the ante from a podcast to a live cast. And Radius Inspire had a health drop-in session on the menopause. And I think these are all important issues, but like today is probably a World AIDS Day. We're really highlighting one of the critical issues and the HIV pandemic that affected society and the LGBTQ plus society group in particular over the past number of decades. And we're really delighted that we're bringing to the fore for people here who can talk about their experiences and what it actually means and the legacy and what it means today. And this is the kind of platform that we want to continue to provide as we create an inclusive environment for everybody. So on that, I was just here to hand over and let Sally take a lead and talk through what's been from my perspective, I lived it, and understanding what it meant to those that were personally impacted by it is something quite special. So we're fortunate to have that support from Body Positive, who are our partner in the LGBTQ plus arena and how we become more inclusive as an organisation. So over to Sally, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Tim. And I'd like to thank Radius as well for hosting us for this World AIDS Day event. My name is Sally Probert-Hill. I am the Chief Executive of Body Positive, and we are an LGBTQ plus charity that does work around sexual health and LGBTQ plus support. Originally, the Body Positives were formed as part of the response to HIV and AIDS. In the 1990s, it was a group of gay men who came together to support each other after they've had a positive diagnosis. Obviously, over the years, the nature of the support, the medication, etc., has changed, but we still offer support to people with a positive HIV diagnosis today. So today is a day to remember the people that we lost to HIV and AIDS, but also their friends, families, and the wider communities who were devastated by the AIDS pandemic. We're here to support the diversity of those living with HIV, and despite the huge advances in medical treatment, they still face a degree of challenges today in their daily lives. So we've got a contribution from a range of speakers who we must thank for giving their time for free, so thank you everybody. In this session we're going to cover an update of the current treatment and statistics around HIV. And the panel discussion that we'll have later will feature highly personal stories that the panellists can bring to give an insight into HIV and AIDS through the years. So on our panel today, we have Colin Avery, who is currently the LGBTQ plus lead for Body Positive, and he has over 40 years personal and professional experience in the HIV and AIDS field. Anita Binns. Anita has been an active HIV and AIDS campaigner for over 20 years, and she will be bringing her very personal story of living with HIV from the 1980s. And Norma Turner. Norma was one of the first HIV specialist clinical nurses in the Northwest, chair of George House Trust and the Manchester AIDS Line. She's worked extensively in Africa and India supporting communities to help them develop their practices and policies on managing HIV and AIDS. So thank you. So firstly, I'm going to invite Colin to give us a brief overview of the current state of HIV and AIDS in the UK.
Thank you, Sally. So today is World AIDS Day, and this is the 35th World AIDS Day that commemorates the lives, the losses and the experiences of people who are living with or affected by HIV globally. It's also worth noting that there have been over 35 million recorded deaths in that time. So that's 1 million deaths for every year that we've worn the red ribbon, which was the original ribbon and continues to be the ribbon that commemorates World AIDS Day. In those 35 years, there have been significant changes. We have seen the introduction of testing, we've seen the introduction of new treatments, and also hopes for the future. And so there is an initiative, a global initiative called 90-90-90, which is to see that 90% of the people who are at risk of HIV are tested, that of that 90%, they will go on to treatment, and of that 90%, that other 90%, that they will become undetectable. And so the 90-90-90 campaign, we hope that by the year 2030 in the UK, we'll see no more new cases of HIV transmission. And that's an amazing achievement if that can be done. Globally, there are other challenges. There continue to be challenges in different communities about addressing their particular issues of prevention and protection, and that understanding of the cultural differences that are experienced globally is equally important as to the issues around treatment. We have seen new therapies come online, which means that now, providing that someone is detected early and tested early and starts the new therapies, they ought to be able to live a normal and natural life expectancy, free of the damage that we saw in the early years of HIV to people's immune systems, and the outcomes will be very different. And if the virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, is suppressed, not only does it mean that someone will be able to live with what becomes a chronic infection, it also means that their risk of transmission to other people is eliminated. So you will also see the U equals U. And that means that if it's undetectable as a viral infection in someone's body using the tests that we have, it's also untransmissible. And while that is a fantastic achievement, for those who are living with HIV, we still have to combat the stigma and the prejudice that is still out there when people are confronted not with the abstract concept of HIV, but a living person sitting in front of them, drinking tea, coffee, or asking for services, and the impact that has, because whilst there has been progress medically, the social changes that are required still lag behind, and the prejudice and the stigma is still out there. We've also seen advances where the drug therapies that suppress the virus inside someone can also be used to prevent someone becoming infected in the first place. And that is known as PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis. There's PEP, which is post-exposure prophylaxis, I have to remember the two. So pre-exposure prophylaxis, which means if you take the tablets in advance of having sexual activity where you think you might be at risk of having sex with someone who may or may not have HIV, or if you're in a relationship with someone with HIV, if you take the tablet before having sex and after having sex, it means that the virus should not be able to establish itself in your system. And you can either do that on a daily basis, which some people choose, or you may choose to do it on an event basis, which is when people are knowing that they're perhaps going out to a swingers party or to a sauna and plan to have unprotected sex, then knowing that's what they're going to do, they can protect themselves and others by using PrEP. So it's a very different environment clinically to what it used to be. But socially, we still have challenges. And today what we'll be doing is bringing that experience of going through a number of decades of what it was like to live with the issues both clinically and socially of HIV to help inform and understand how we may face those challenges going forward.
Thanks, Colin. So if I could ask you, Anita, when was the first time that you became aware of this thing called AIDS, as I think it very much was then?
It was very early. I've always been part of the LGBTQ community, so having quite a lot of gay friends, I knew there was an illness, there was a thing that was happening, and even though I was sexually active, it was never, oh, you need to use condoms, or you need to be more careful, be more choosy who you sleep with, because it was something that was never talked about for us. It was always talked about within the gay field, and it was even advertised, as we all remember those awful adverts, as a gay disease for men. It was never anything that would affect women, and certainly was never looked at in the heterosexual community. So for me, the first time I came across working with someone with HIV was in 1992, when I worked in London, and it was awful. It was, the young guy was in a home that you pay a lot of money for, private, for terminally ill, and when I went in as a carer to look after him, I could see that he was quite devastated, he was quite withdrawn, and we had a little chat. I realised what had happened, so I washed him, helped him have something to eat. What had basically happened is his partner had put him into the home while they got the house sorted. He was dying of AIDS. I'd never actually knowingly come across anyone before, but did it worry me? Did it concern me? No, because, you know, I'm an intelligent person. But what was happening was, I'm not a qualified nurse, but these other nurses that were qualified were refusing to treat this guy. So they'd got the money for him to stay there, but no one was looking after him. So I helped to take him home and and helped his partner to nurse him until he died. So that was the first time I came across it, and it was just devastating to see this beautiful couple going through the worst time in their life, and there was no one there to help them.
So what was this sort of hospital and care environment like at that time?
Well, I actually thought it was really good until I came across it. And then as soon as I came across, my husband had a head injury, so I was like fighting the headway fight, and then all of a sudden I had this new thing. I was like, they're doing this to my friends, and I'm not the type to sit back and go, oh wow. I'm like, there must be something I can do. So straight away I started volunteering down in London. I changed what I was doing for my degree from basing it around social work for people with head injuries, which obviously I was living that life because my husband had a serious head injury, to now I realise there's this whole other group of people that nobody even wants to touch. You know, we all remember what Princess Diana did and the amazing impact that had on other, but no one wanted to just do that, and that's what they needed. You know, we can do marvellous things with medicine, and I agree in what you're saying, the medicine's come on tremendously, and from what people were given in the early days. But what's the point in making them live if no one wants to touch them, if no one wants to love them? They're just literally dying alone. Mm-hmm. And sadly, that still happens in some cases and in some countries. But that was the one thing I just said, I cannot sit back. So I straight away got involved. And then when I moved back up north with Body Positive in Blackpool and Manchester.
Yeah, thank you. Norma, obviously you worked in the health sector. What was the first time it kind of came onto your radar?
Well, my background was microbiology and nursing, and I wanted to specialise in infection control at the time, and I hadn't really sort of, you know, the HIV jobs and so on and so forth weren't prominent then. And but what happened was that we're in Manchester with a left council, active unions, a state-of-the-art infectious disease unit at Monsell, And in 1985, a man was, they got an order to keep him in hospital through the courts because he wanted to go home and die. And they said, the chief medical officer at the time decided that this was a danger and went to court. They were in, the magistrate's court for about 5 minutes. And she said, is bleeding profusely, is a danger to the community, and he must be kept in hospital. And there was the Public Order Act to control infectious diseases, which was 1984. And AIDS was added to it in 1985. And within the provision of that act, people are allowed to detain patients if they're felt with certain diseases, if they're felt to be at risk to
Could you give me an idea of what
community.
other diseases were counted on that?
No, or any infectious diseases, because it wasn't, there's notifiable, it's quite complex, there's notifiable diseases. AIDS isn't a notifiable disease. No. That's things like cholera, diphtheria, Ebola, and anthrax and so on. But they are diseases that can be easily spread, like TB, any of these sorts of things. Polio, smallpox, all those sorts of diseases. And AIDS was added to that. But it's the provision that you can detain people that was used. Now, this was shocking, and that somebody was being prevented, who was dying, being prevented from dying in a place that they wanted to die in. So there was, a lot of campaigning about that. I mean, it was overturned quite quickly, but there was a lot of campaigning within the unions, within, all sorts of areas, within the gay community and so on. And it was overturned because he was too ill to go home, and he decided he would stay in hospital. But, I mean, and so it just brought it into the fore, and it changed the way health looked at HIV and AIDS. They realised, and especially Monsell Hospital, to give them the due, realised they needed to listen to the people themselves. So, like people from the gay community, from Body Positive and so on, were drawn in to look in how services should be developed. And within the community, I was a community nurse, they started to look at not just, trying to get people into sexually transmitted diseases, but in sexually transmitted departments to test, but realised that there was a lot of support needed, there was counselling needed, that there was, lots of different things. So I then went in to specialise within HIV and AIDS. And it was useful because I know viruses, I love viruses. And so, I was drawn by the virus rather than the people.
It's just funny when you say I love a virus.
And, so that, it was that kind of shocking way of it being publicly out there. We've got a strong gay community. We've got, we're in Manchester, for God's sake, and this is the first person that's, kind of kept into hospital. And I did become a clinical nurse specialist, and, I supported, we set up home care, and I supported at least 100 people to die at home. And I never came across somebody that was bleeding profusely. Because when they create that image out there, you just imagine that somebody's spurting blood everywhere and
Yeah.
splashing it everywhere as they go home. You know, he probably was having nosebleeds, you know, that kind of. And so it was just the imagery that was being put out that was just so horrible and so frightening, and really meant that people, like Anita was saying, wouldn't touch, wouldn't go near, just
Yeah.
in case, you know, like kind of. So that was my introduction to it.
Okay. So, Colin, you worked as a volunteer and in the sort of charity and third sectors supporting people around HIV. So, what was your first memory of, what was the first time you actually were aware of HIV and AIDS?
I had moved to Manchester in the early 1980s, and, you know, I was a young man in my 20s. So it was an opportunity to live life to the full and be independent. And I also helped staff what was then the gay switchboard. And we were getting calls from people who'd heard about this thing that was happening in New York and San Francisco, particularly of gay men dying of diseases that seemed really unique and unusual, certainly in young people. And it was mainly pneumonia. And so we were getting calls from people who were worried about the implications of this. But in the 1980s, you know, America was a long, long, long way away. You know, getting to Blackpool for your holidays was you know, quite a challenge. So it felt distant. So I was reading up articles to be able to offer advice and information to people. But then one of my really close friends told me that his brother-in-law had died of something that was then known as GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, which later we knew as AIDS and ultimately was caused by HIV. And that was in the early 1980s. So when I was in the pubs and clubs and people were talking about this disease being over there in America and hopefully we'll be safe, it was already here, folks.
And I think there was something to say about the initial campaigns. I think those of us who were old enough remember the icebergs and the tombstones and the Don't Die of Ignorance leaflets that went to every household. I think it was around 1986 that happened.
I think it's devastating to think of all the things that we need to fight and help each other. And yet our government, and I'm not politically minded, sent a leaflet to every house. So even if your grandma didn't have a telly, she got this leaflet through her door that basically said, you know, and made gay people once again easy targets and horrible targets of some of the things that went through because of this leaflet. Which just astonishes me that they'll never send another leaflet out to tell them, oh, we got it wrong. But that went to every house. Just...
Yeah, and the impact of that is still felt today because a lot of people, that is their only contact or memory of HIV and AIDS. That's the only thing that they know.
Well, my feeling about that particular leaflet was, you know, it was the Don't Die of Ignorance leaflet. And it said, there's a thing out there that's passed, often by gay men. Most of it is hidden away. And you're not really at risk, but don't share toothbrushes and razors. And so it was contradictory in the messages that it was sending out there. So this idea of don't die of ignorance, it didn't inform you about what you were ignorant of, other than the fact that gay men, in particular, were risky people to be around. Yeah. And, you know, whilst I applaud that that began a programme of education and awareness, it didn't give people education and awareness. It just terrified them. And it didn't matter whether you were someone who was informed and aware or this was your first encounter. It was just a terrifying campaign.
It was also, I think, you know, reflected society, because our society is still the same, but you didn't talk about sex and you didn't talk about death. You talked around it. Yeah. But, you know, it was a sexually transmitted disease. Let's talk about sex. It's something that can, you know, like kind of at the time, because there wasn't the medication, could mean that people could die. Let's talk about death and how you manage that. No, none of that. It was just fear, prejudice, and so on. And that actually kept the ignorance going. And, you know, with within the health sector, you know, people were really very ignorant about it, unless you were in, you know, the infectious disease units where they dealt with all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But, you know, it was really difficult to just get other health workers to come on board and stop that whole way of approaching people.
Do you think that it generated a climate of homophobia, which of course led to the first anti-gay legislation in 100 years, which was Section 28? So do you think that kind of that fear of gay men particularly in this case, do you think that the HIV and AIDS was kind of the messages around it? Do you think that led to that?
I think there were two things that were happening at the same time, because in the early 80s we were seeing a rise in the idea of gay pride and of going on pride marches and that sense of being out and proud. And that was one of the things that drew me to Manchester, was to be that. And then suddenly, here is this wonderful infection that the bigots can use to say, see, this is what happens when you become a liberal society. You invite this kind of horrible disease in. And now we're having to think about how we protect ourselves because of how these evil deviants are behaving. And, you know, we're even at risk of teaching in schools that it's okay to be gay. And, you know, all of that was going on at the time. And the rise in homophobia and institutionalised homophobia and giving legitimacy to all sorts of acts and statements by the powers that be meant that, as someone, as I say, in my 20s, the idea to be out and proud was a challenge. It was a risky thing to do because of the assumptions that were made about who I was or how I behaved or the risks that I posed to other people, and that was shared across that whole community. But it also became something that lived under people's skin because, as Norma said, you wanted to celebrate relationships, but there was a risk that in that relationship, to have sex and love someone actually meant that you may be giving each other something that could kill you. And to be at work meant that if people knew that you were gay, suddenly it was like you had to be careful about keeping your own cup or not sharing desks or pens or all these beliefs that people had. And that constant pressure of fear was incredibly oppressive.
Yeah. And of course, you could be sacked for being gay, let alone being HIV positive.
Yeah.
So that kind of fear and tension and stress that it created on people.
Yeah.
I mean, so generally at first, the image was and the understanding was that it was very much gay men and injecting drug users, so people who could be pushed to, say, the margins of society. But Anita, do you want to sort of tell your experience, because you didn't fit with that stereotype?
Absolutely not. Even though I'd been caring for people with HIV, I worked with the community aid support team in Preston. I'm a body positive in Blackpool as a volunteer. I was going to theatre one night. They had a thing on for blood donors. My son, who was 5.5 at the time, I couldn't quite explain what it was, and he wasn't the type that you could ignore. So I went in and donated blood. He got to see a little video, and then he understood what blood donation was. 2 weeks later, I was actually supposed to be working in Blackpool on a stall for a community aid support team that morning, and I received a letter from the Lancaster Blood Service saying there was a major discrepancy in my blood donation, And I was like, oh my God, what could it be? So I rang, I can say his name because one of the most wonderful people ever, Alan Lyons, and we used to have especially social workers then. There's none of the funding now. I was working with him that day, so I rang him and I was like, oh my God, I've got to go to Lancaster. And he's like, you all right? And I was like, well, it's just all very odd. I'm going to be late. You set the stall up. And he's like, yeah, that's fine. So I got to Lancaster, and I now know this guy got the short straw that day, and I was like, he was all very nervous, and I'm like, what is it? I don't like to beat around the bush, I kind of like to get the point. He said I had to give him another blood sample, and that to come back the week after, and I was like, that's not happening, we talked today. And he just said, right, okay, so we found your donation to be HIV positive, and I was like, oh my God. We went through a few other questions. I instantly was crying. Obviously, my whole world just exploded like a volcano. And he just said, don't you find it quite interesting, Mrs. Binns? You move back up north, you join a community aid support team, you put your husband in permanent care, and then you casually donate blood. And I was like, wow, I think we need to end the conversation here, and I'm leaving, which I did. Alan Lyons picked me up at Preston Station. I'd said to the gentleman when I was there, oh my God, my child. And he was like, don't be ridiculous. Your son's been treated by Guy's Hospital. It's one of the best teaching hospitals in the country. And I was like, oh, you don't even want to speak to me, really. And I get it. It must have been awful because as much as you might have gone to training courses, no one ever prepared you for that actual conversation and that person in front of you, like you said before, oh my God, there's one here. So we picked my son up from school that day. Same day testing in 1995 wasn't something that was done regular, was it? It was like a rare cases. And we'd just done some training on children with HIV. Unbeknownst to me, my child was going to be that first. We tested him that day, and a 5.5-year-old child was HIV positive. So all the dreams that we had for him, the hopes, I knew were now gone. I knew that meant, because I already had knowledge, unlike a lot of people who found out they were positive, back in 95, I had amazing support. I was already part of the gay community, which we all know just gives you the best snuggle blanket to cure anything. And, well, we couldn't cure HIV, but they make you feel better. And we were just devastated that day because I knew the implications for everything that was going to happen. I'm not a wallflower, which straight away the people who around me were like, she's not going to be quiet. And I just felt it was important that the people who cared for us knew our status. So I wanted the school to be informed, telling your doctor, your dentist. And they're going, oh my God, no, don't do it. You can imagine, can't you? Like, please don't do that, Anita. I was lucky that the two teachers of my son's school were amazing. The school weren't, but the two teachers still stayed friends for years. And one of them I bumped into a few years ago. And when she realised who I was, she started crying. And she went, I don't ask. I went, no, he's alive. And she's like, no, really? And like, we're back in contact. And she was like, so for me, I knew that day, by the next week, because we didn't do viral load then, we did CD4. My son had no immune system at all, and I had 3. A normal immune system should be about 700, 800. So basically, I was told to put my affairs in order, and the chances are my son wouldn't see the year out, and maybe the opportunity I might die before him, so we have to look at everything. I found an amazing gay couple, and I didn't find a gay couple because it was HIV. They were my friends. I live quite an open lifestyle, and I want my child to be continued to be brought up like that. So the option for me was just go with my friends. We had to go to court for that because they weren't married and they were gay. It was quite a bizarre situation. I didn't get involved in the details. I just left them with that. But it was quite a bizarre situation in court when I had to stand there and say that was my choices. Our lives were just changed overnight. I would say to anyone, if you ever find out you've got a terminal illness or something that could be terminal, don't remortgage your house and get a £10,000 loan for a kitchen you don't intend to fit. Because that's what I did, thinking, well, I'm going to be dead, and it won't really matter. We had some amazing holidays, but I've had to pay the money back now. So that's why you should never do that. But yeah, at the time, I just thought, why not? I want my child to see the world. I want him to have the fun holidays, and that's kind of what we did.
So do you think that at the time, did you know anybody else who,
I knew
in
other
your
people.
situation, who
No,
were the same?
I didn't know anybody else. And it's as strange as it is, even though I've been around people with HIV and nursed people with AIDS, it never even entered my head that it was something that we should think about. Neither me or my partner were virgins when we got married in 1988. Who infected who is a question I don't even... it's the first question most people ask. Like, no one ever says, oh, how did you get cancer? Or how did you get a disease or an illness? But this is the first thing people ask, and I'm like, is that really relevant? A young lady I used to do talks with, she got it through the blood transfusions, as quite a lot of people did years ago. And it used to really infuriate her that she felt I was made to be look dirty and horrible to the audience who were asking us questions, and she was like, oh, what a shame, because you only got it because of that. Well, she's dirty. And we still get that today, you know. You get people to look at you and go, well, you were always a bit, well, I was always a bit what? Doing the human thing that we all do, but you're right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it was the hierarchy, wasn't it? You know, gay, and then black, and promiscuous, and, you know, like kind of, you've just got that hierarchy of people that, you know, should be kept away from, and then you're sympathetic with certain other people.
Yeah, that concept of innocent victims and
Yeah.
by
It's
implication.
in every, it is throughout.
Yeah, but the fact is, when we went into Guy's Hospital with my son, all they looked at was a young, white, middle-class person. They never tested my son for HIV. My son didn't have cancer, by the way. He was treated for an illness he never had because they never thought to test him for HIV. Mm-hmm. So in the 3 years that he was under their care, I just, and straight away that day, I was like, oh my God, all they've ever talked about is immune system. Why didn't we even think of this? And this, don't be silly. And that's because I'm a white person who, well, they don't know if I'm a prostitute or not, but they assumed I wasn't, rightly, by the way. And I wasn't an intravenous drug user. So straight away, all they see is white and doesn't even come into our category. So when I do my talks, I did my first, you're going to be shocked, my first positive speaking 6 months after I found out. And because I knew the importance that I ended up working in bars and clubs, and you see people, you know, on the Friday night, they're with the male, you know, the girls do what they do and the boys do what they do. On a Saturday night, the couples go out, but you would see the same couples in that bar who they weren't with that girl or they weren't with that boy last night, and tonight they're with their wives and husbands, and you're like, you want to scream at them, don't. But you can't, because I would probably lose my job, people would look at me differently, and what would happen?
Yeah. And of course, Norma, what about testing at that time? Was that something that was routine, or was, as Anita said, just maybe if people thought, may well, apt there again?
No, it wasn't routine, and quite rightly it wasn't routine, actually. I mean, I'm not convinced that it should be routine, because, you know, until you've got you've got the support there, you've got the treatment there, and you've got, you know, sort of all of the issues dealt with, then it's a massive, massive thing. Now, testing now, people are more willing because the treatment's better. Yes. But no, testing wasn't there. And we did have testing, but, you know, you'd got 3 weeks before you got the results? And within that time, if you'd had sex again, then, you know, like kind of they wouldn't give you a negative and so on. But what they did was fund people, and a lot of people were employed to do the testing in a way that you know, you kind of could support people, that they were well informed about the issues, what they should do, what they shouldn't do, and so on. So no, testing wasn't absolutely available, but it was, it was, all the systems were put in place to train people to make sure that it was done as safely as possible for the people that were going to be facing it. And that wasn't just about gay prejudice, it was about any prejudice. You know, people were so frightened of the disease that, you know, like anybody, you know, like yourself or anybody saying it, people, you know, are going to be thinking, really?
Yeah.
You know, and so consequently, you're okay if you're in a positive, you know, a supportive environment. Yeah. But a lot of people don't work in a supportive environment. They work in a factory, they work in a shop, they work at whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, like kind of they're finished.
Yeah.
And their families, you don't know how the family will take it or any of those sorts of things. So no, but what did happen was that a lot of resources were put in. You know, there were specialists, like you say, there were specialist nurses, there were specialist social workers, occupational health, and so on. But the most important thing is the communities were involved. So they had people from, you know, that were experienced around drug taking and needle exchange and so on. They had a lot of body positive people involved. They had people around immigration and so on involved. So, and that was included. So that was really the start of much better facilities being around for people.
Yeah. And around, so it was around about 95 that the antiretroviral therapies came in. That was the combination therapies that were started to be effective.
Not as early as that.
Well,
but roundabout.
Roundabout then.
Yeah.
So, Colin, did you see any difference in people's attitudes when sort of the effective medication started to come through?
It actually was before the effective medication, because you have to remember there were various drug trials that were introduced, and I think particularly the one that I was aware of was AZT, and it was administered at toxic levels.
It's awful.
But until that point, if you tested positive, it's like, as Anita said, the journey was mapped for you, which is you're going to die, and you're going to die quickly, and you're going to die horribly. And so, you know, we'll do what we can for you, and, you know, we'll make certain that the wall's got pretty flowers in and things like that. But that's just trying to kind of gloss over what the direction of travel is. And to experience that for people was horrible. So as Norma said, and Anita said, it was the support within the community and those people who were willing to learn and develop the knowledge base and skills to support people, but actually not to offer very much. And then along comes AZT. And so the community-based model almost went out the window at that point, because now the medics had something that they felt that they could offer.
I don't think it was as early as that, really, because the AZT still didn't, you know, do anything. It was the combination therapy wasn't until the 1990s, you know.
Yeah, 1995,
yeah.
6, yeah.
But it was that beginning of the clawing back of, rather than using a community model to support people, to say, no, we as medics can now start to assume control, and the community voice began to get quieter. But what was also happening is that people were being given these very toxic drugs, and also there were very tight strictures on how it could be used. So you had to take it at exactly the same time, which was every 4 hours. You couldn't vary it by a minute or two, and the messages that went out is if you did, then you would ruin your treatment and potentially put your life at risk. Yeah. So I remember being at conferences, I'm sure Norma and Anita do, where suddenly you'd have all these automatic pill boxes going off, and everyone rushing to take
It
the
wasn't
tablets.
a rave, it was like horrible pills. Just, you know.
So off to take your medication. But one of the side effects of the medication was that within about 20 minutes, you got extreme diarrhea. And so people would rush off to take the tablets, come back and sit down. 20 minutes later, they'd all be rushing off, looking like Hercule Poirot, walking very quickly to kind of hopefully make it to the services before something drastic happened. And people took it because it was the only thing on offer. It didn't matter whether it was effective. It was the only thing that was on offer.
Yeah.
It was hope. We
I
just
was
thought
just
we had
like, say,
hope.
ask Anita. Were there? Can you remember? Were there other things that people kind of like it went round saying, "Oh, if this works or this
Oh
works"?
yeah,
or-
like I mean, I don't think there was a drug trial I didn't do. I'm terrible for going, yeah, go on, I'll do it. And some of the drug trials I did were just terrible. And the side effects were always the worst thing. I remember one drug trial, they pumped us with pure oil, and they believed that it would make a difference. There was 10 of us in that, and I'm the only one left from that group. And it literally made your veins like you were going to turn like you were turning into some superhero, and it did things to your bodily fluids that were inexplicable. And then I couldn't bend my arm, so I was a bit like Jesus walking around. And my partner at the time thought it was really funny. He had to just pop me into these clothes, and then it was just go back the next day for another round. But DDI was the worst. DDI was horrendous. It was quite a thick tablet, and you dissolved it in the tiniest bit of water because it tasted awful. But you literally, it sounds a bit, but you had to be sat on the toilet with your head in the sink because it just came out both sides. And if you did, you had to take it again. So that it had to be in your body for at least an hour without you being sick or having diarrhea for it to have even become effective. And you had to take this 3 times a day. So me and my son, I'm laughing like it was funny, but sometimes you tell a really bad story and the only way you get through it is by laughing. But me and my son would literally be in the bathroom. I'd be on the toilet and he was on this makeshift potty we had with our heads in the bath. And I'm like, you're never getting to school today, mate. And he's like 6 years old, taking these medications. So the children also took these medications. And it was devastating because you couldn't eat. You couldn't do anything. And how some people went to work was beyond me.
And I think what we was talking about, Colin and Norm, was that the community side of support developed itself prior to the medication being available. And then as soon as the medication came on, it's like, well, you need that. Whereas this great model that had been set up, this, amazing support.
Yeah, but I think the model continued for quite a while, really, until the combination and it was working.
Yeah.
Because they still recognised that, complementary medicines were available, better food, was made available. You'd got teams of people that were working together with the voluntary sector as well. So I think that lasted for quite a while. But when the government realised, unlike with some other diseases, that actually it was being fairly confined to, gay people, and the heterosexual spread was small. And it tended to be in other countries where you'd get more of the heterosexual. Once they thought, actually, it's a bit like with COVID that we've had recently, when they realised that it was just being the old and the ill that were going to die, let them die. And that was a bit the attitude there, because there was not a critical mass in England or within the heterosexual community to mean that the infection was that worrying for everybody. And that was just lucky, but once they'd got those kind of statistics, that's when they started withdrawing the funding. But that is at the same time, the pharmaceutical companies saw the pound signs. And they could have spent that kind of money developing vaccines. But actually, they used the human guinea pigs that were all ready because they were already HIV to test their medication. And it's a bit like the perpetual arms race. You know, if you can keep people on medication all your lives, how much money are you going to make? And we can always improve this medication. So we've got the next batch and the next batch and the next batch. And there was, you know, within India, I mean, I worked in India and Africa, and they could create these drugs generically and cheaply so that they could have had access. And the pharmaceutical companies in America took their money away, took them to court so that they couldn't create those generic drugs. So there was all this money and power game that started with the actual, and that's when people become invisible.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And I think if we can just move on to kind of talking away from the kind of the medication side of things, but to the stigma side, which is something that still seems to be very much present. I'm just wondering, Anita, if I can ask you, is there a particular incident that you can think of where you know, the kind of the ignorance was sort of shown up?
I'm very lucky with when I started working for a guy, he had some bars and nightclubs, and he was opening a new nightclub, and I was like, I'm going to be your general manager, and this is all your money's gone into this. I do not want you to lose out. So I was like, we need to have a chat. And there's something I've not told you, and if you ever come out, I'm not quite sure what the response would be because I'm the face of your bar. And he was like, are you kidding? And I was like, no. And he went, just get out and I'll see you tomorrow. Because the bar was all in, you know, we had the builders in. And I thought, oh, he's really mad at me. So I walked outside and I started crying. I was like, oh my God. And he rang me, he went, get back. And I walked back in and he'd gone into the office. He gave me £2,000. He went, take you and Glenn on holiday. And he went, I'll see you next week. He gave me a hug and he went, you're still the face of my bar. And I was like, how amazing is that? He was never... And you know, we're going back in, that was like 98, 99. But in 2020, and I want you to remember that number, guys, 2020, this is 3 years ago. I'd been working in my office for over 5 years. And being the quiet little wallflower I am, I'm really good at doing the parties and making your desk look ridiculous on your birthday, and bringing cakes in for Madonna's Day. And I was always helpful to my colleagues. There was no reason, or I didn't think this would ever happen. But one of the people found out my status. It was used against me. I walked into the office that day, and you know, you just know there's something going on. And this particular person just like looked and went, I'd hang myself if I had AIDS as well. If you'd given me AIDS as well. And I was like, why would he say that? My previous partner had took his own life. It had nothing to do with my status. He hadn't got HIV from me. He had his own mental health problems. And I just sat at my desk and I was like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? As everyone was coming in, he'd obviously told everybody. The conversations that went around were disgusting. I literally sat at my desk and it broke me. I just couldn't understand these people I'd worked with. And I worked in a sales environment, so we all know how hot dog that can be. But it wasn't just these three guys that literally ran with it and just humiliated me all the time. It was the other people in that room that never stood up. And I remember one day when I was literally sat there, we had a new manager in, and he emailed me, Anita, you all right? And I was literally shredding with tears. They were stood at the end of my desk. Well, there's like 5 desks in the row, saying the most awful things about AIDS. Don't worry, we're going to make sure she goes down. Da, da, da. And it was just so horrible. He emailed me, but I couldn't stop crying. I went out of the room, and one of the senior managers was there. We went through a disciplinary. Absolutely couldn't believe. The first one, nothing happened. Then this new manager came in, and one person got sacked. The other 2 people didn't. They just got a warning. Hello. It continued. There was a new guy that started in the office, and he was sat behind me with this particular person. And he was like, oh, so what's the script? You know, proper boy. He was like, like, oh, she's nice, she's nice. Oh, what's the script with Anita then? He went, oh, forget it, mate, she's riddled, she's got the AIDS, and if you effing start mucking around or say anything, you'll only end up in the head office. And I was literally sat there like that, and I just burst out crying. I was like, I can't take this anymore. I'd already, it affected my mental health. This was a year. This didn't just happen over 5-10 minutes. And it affected my mental health so bad. I was cutting myself. I'd tried to take my own life. But I continued to go in. I thought, you're not going to beat me. And I just sat there that day and I was like, I can't fight this anymore. And as I turned to my left, my senior manager was looking at me, and I was like, and he could see me crying. He put his head down. He was pretty intimidated by these guys. They weren't like nice people, but that doesn't make what was happening. So I emailed him and I said, I need to speak to you outside. I went, you've just heard exactly what was said. And he was like, do you know what, Anita, if you just got your head down, you wouldn't hear what people say about you. And at that point, I knew I had to leave that company. I wish, everyone keeps saying you should have took them to court. Sometimes there's some things you've got to walk away
you've
from.
got to walk away from it. Otherwise, you can't save yourself.
Yeah, I had to save myself. I mean, luckily I went back to George House, which George House has always been amazing. We don't have a body positive anymore in Manchester and Blackpool, sadly. But I went back to George House, and they did what they always do, put a big massive blanket of love around me and fixed me. But I was a very broken person. And I know that office space is still as awful as it was and toxic, but what it did to me was took me back to that first day that I found out I was positive, and I just felt so damaged, and I thought that everyone in the world still felt like that about us, and that I couldn't have a life again. The lockdown was horrible for most people. For me, it was like, it saved my life because I could hide and heal from what had happened.
The prejudice spread beyond the individuals, because I mean there was a lot of incidents like that, because we were community nurses and covered, you know, the whole of Greater Manchester, and a guy died in one of the you know, local hospitals, not in the and I got a phone call from his mother, and she was totally distraught. And she'd gone into the hospital. She'd had them to pick her up, you know, to tell her. Anyway, she'd gone in, and he wasn't there. And she says, oh, and the nurse just said to her, oh, we've had to bag him up already. And so this mother was imagining a son had been thrown into bin bags, and it'd been sent to the, you know, like kind of funeral director. And so we contacted the funeral director, and I said, you know, she needs to see her son. And they wouldn't open the coffin because that was their rule at that funeral director. So I had to find another funeral director to actually move the coffin there when they could open it, so she could just see that her son wasn't in a bin bag. You know, and that kind of, you know, ignorance and prejudice spread to the whole family. Not just to the individual themselves, you know, like kind of, there was some really terrifying examples that people went through, but as long as you had the support, then you could fight it, you know. But the problem is now there's better treatment, but actually the support systems aren't as strong, because, you know, either people are blasé about it, or the funding isn't there, or whatever, and the awareness. And that's why this is important, to actually kind of let people know where we've been, where we've come, and where we still need to go, and whether we'll ever get there or not, and whether we'll end up going round in circles.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree with you so much that, you know, it's a classic thing I find, that everyone, you were treated, and we're looked after, and we're going to live longer. I mean, I will probably outlive you, and the reason for that is I get looked after so much better. Yeah. It's all Botox, I promise you, it's all Botox. But we get looked after so much better. Like, people are now going into our hospitals, having the bloods and stuff done. So we are living longer because we're finding illnesses with us earlier.
Yeah.
So, you know, we are living longer, but there is no, like, if I wouldn't have had George House to go to in 2020, where would I have gone? You know, if I was, I know where to go, do you know what I mean? But what if I was a woman who didn't know where to go? What if that had just happened to me and I didn't know that these places were out there? Because they are getting smaller. There has to be a point where the heterosexual community stop relying on the gay community, because it isn't a gay disease. We need somewhere to go. I go to a women's group, and I mean, sometimes we don't even talk about HIV, we talk about going out or hair or whatever, or men. But then there are times when we need to. And without them groups, I wouldn't be here today for what we've done over the last, and some of the sessions I've been involved in, and the women's groups. I wouldn't be here because I had nothing to build me back up with. You know, I was just bricks and no cement, and they just redo everything. So I agree with you that we have all this. We do still need specialist social workers. We do need a specialist nurse, because no one else understands how we feel.
No.
Okay, so I'm just thinking about employment in particularly. So now, since 2010, there's been the Equality Act. So it specifically mentions HIV status. So everybody's got shiny policies, haven't they? Everyone's got their equality and diversity policies. Yet 2020, which is shockingly recent, is still very rife. So, Colin, can I ask you, what can be done to kind of bridge that theoretical equality of policies to the actual cultural implication of that within a company?
There's a whole process of education that's required, and an understanding of the basics of what HIV is and what the risks are, in order that you can begin to develop a model for yourself of, am I safe, am I not safe? And without that, you have no foundation to be able to do any of the more developmental work other than for people to pay lip service. And one of the areas that I was inspired to do was basic HIV awareness training, because I'm a communicator. And I was able to take what to me were very complex medical concepts and turn them into something that it was possible to communicate for an ordinary person to understand. And I had some great support along the way, and Norma and I did some fantastic training events. But we would go into health teams, having been told that they'd had basic awareness training, and then it was clear that their knowledge of infection control and risk just wasn't there. So trying to talk about support for individuals within that system was never going to embed, because people were still frightened. And so unless you can take that fear away to start with, you're never going to be able to move forward. So compassion and understanding are central to be able to tackle issues about prejudice and discrimination. And normalising something to a level where it makes sense to you and you understand what the implications are, you can start to move forward. And so in any company, if you're aware that you're trying to implement any kind of equality, diversity and inclusion policy, you have to make certain that people are able to grasp and understand the implications of equality, diversity and inclusion for me and how it impacts me, to therefore understand why it's important when we apply it to others. Otherwise, you end up in an Anita situation where it's so easy to turn your colleague into a nothing. And once you've turned someone into a nothing, you can do what you like to them.
So we've had a question about what do we think we can do to overcome the stigma, because it very much obviously still exists, and I think a lot of people, especially in the workplace, are not out about their status for their own kind of self-preservation in a lot of cases. So are there things that we can do to tackle that stigma? Norma?
No, I think the best way of tackling stigma is for people to be open and out about it. And I understand that isn't, like kind of easy for people. But certainly when the atmosphere was out there, and hearing people's stories, getting to know people, I mean, it's very much like racism, like anything else, like kind of, I've got a black friend, he's all right, but the rest of them should die in the like kind of sea.
Yeah.
And it's the same with, I've got a gay friend and they're all right, but, like kind of, I don't want them, sort of coming near my kids or whatever. So I think it's about conversation, about being open and so on. And the problem is that as the world gets harder for people economically and so on and so forth, a lot of people fall back on their prejudices. Yeah. Sort of somebody has to be blamed for this, and it can't be people that are really to blame. So let me find somebody. And, I just think when we had the chance to be talking about sex, about sexuality, about death, about all of these things, actually more people came on board. It gets rid of the fear. Yeah. And once you close in again, then, like kind of, it doesn't. And I mean, I think, the gay community still has a responsibility, but I think all of us have a responsibility, to actually communicate. Mm-hmm. And that's how, you can overcome it. You're never going to easily, if you've got a few people around, but you've got to have a culture where there's more support. And it's also other people challenging it, because I know, this is over racism, but I say being sat at a cafe and, there's been a black waiter or something, and some white woman at the side of me going, oh, do you want to eat that or something like that? Mm-hmm. Now, I don't put my head down. I go, I think you're appalling, you should get out of here, like kind of, and show them up. But mostly we try to duck the issue. And so you see somebody being done for on a bus or whatever, you don't get up in case you get your head knocked off as well, but you have to. You have to communicate, and I think that's the thing. And giving people the tools to communicate is the education, is that's necessary.
I must admit, I was never, I saw one of the questions on there, if I was going to have a one-night stand, I wouldn't tell them I'm positive. I use condoms and I'm safe. If I go into a relationship, then I would tell them. Like if I hooked up with someone and I'm like, oh, actually, I really like you, I'd be like, can we have a chat before we go any further? And I've done that with people that I've just met, and I've said, I need to tell you something about me because I kind of think I like you and I don't want to sleep with you, and then you're like, oh, what have you done? And they're like, oh my God. I've been very lucky. We had this conversation before we moved downstairs, that sometimes I hate telling someone my story because it's so positive. But the previous relationships I've had, I've told them and they're like, that's absolutely fine. I'm here for you. I've got you back. So I'm really, really lucky. And I get the morally in this. It's how many times, and there's going to be people watching this, that your husband or your wife or your girlfriend or partner has come home late and they've done more than what they said at that office party. But you still slept with them. Have you gone to the GUM clinic? How many people do that? And in the heterosexual world, because I ran pubs and clubs, I saw it so much. They do not get tested. Once again, it comes down to the gay community will continue to do stuff and they don't do anything. So how many times, I would say to anyone watching this, have you had sex with someone without a condom and not asked them the status? And how many people are having sex and they don't know the status because they haven't got tested?
Yeah, because
Yeah.
most people a lot of people who are positive know their status, and most other people don't know their status.
And they say.
No, but one of the biggest killers of women was cervical cancer. How did they get cervical cancer? Through, the wart virus, which men transmitted. And there's not been a big stigma about that. There's been a vaccine, there's been,
screening,
so on, and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So it is still down to certain parts of the community, i.e., like kind of gay people, black people, and so on, that need, the stigma's going to come.
But that's what I always say, and I agree with what you're saying, is that I get so tired and so goddamn angry. After what happened to me in my workplace, I came out on social media in March, and I've done loads of stuff on my Insta, and this will be my first YouTube. Evidently, this is where I'm going to get some of the negative bits, but I can back that off, I think. And I say think because I'm not 100% sure, but I'm sure there'll be some troll who's got nothing else to do today. They won't come from this company, trust me, because I've seen this building, it's amazing. But for stigma with me, the only way that we are ever going to overcome the stigma is to talk about it, like you said, and to realise it is part of our lives. HIV isn't going to go away because people are becoming infected still. And we have to face up to talking about it, to being kinder to each other, which the human race struggles with, sadly, and to stand up for other people. Like, no one's... I remember one day when it was particularly bad, I looked at this girl and I was like, my eyes were pleading with her, I was crying, and she just put her head down. And I'm like, you can hear what they're saying, just stand up and say, stop it.
Yeah, yeah, that's not...
And the morality bit, sort of, why HIV? Why is that the one that it's your responsibility? If somebody wants to have sex with you, they have to think about it as well. And we fought this because under Jack Straw, when he was trying to criminalise, so that if you, like if I infected you with HIV, I could go to jail. And we fought it through George House and won. But then it came in, didn't it, in Scotland, first of all. And so, like kind of when you criminalise, that's not about morality. Morality is about openness and talking to people and trusting people. That's what relationships have to... And that's what kids need to be taught about relationships. It's not to be fearful, but actually, to embrace, but recognise that there are, things that you need within that.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'd be quite frightened at the moment if I'd got young kids, because the amount of pornography that people can see and so on is actually shifting the risk that people have put in themselves, not just around sexually transmitted diseases, but just the whole way of being. That I think, and that's about, I mean, we got into schools, we fought into schools and so on, and when it was local government, then they could tell the schools, whereas now schools can decide whether they have sexual education, whether they have relationships and so on. So, we've gone backwards in terms of fighting the prejudice, but that's... But we won that under Thatcher. We were amazing. We did amazing things. And we can do it again. And we can continue to do it. It's just about keeping,
And it's where the money... The first thing everyone's going to say is, where's the money going to come from? And you're like, what are we putting a financial thing on medical treatment, which we do? I mean, luckily, George House still work within schools. I work as a positive... I volunteer as a positive speaker. And it's amazing going and seeing these young people. Like, you think they've got so much knowledge, and you're right, like, they say all these awful things, but they actually don't have the knowledge behind it. They don't understand, like, what's going to happen to you, that, there's certain diseases you can get that actually will make you infertile, which for certain communities, that's going to be a massive issue for them going into their married lives, because you're expected to have children. and they don't actually know the details, and they come out with some of the most amazing questions, and you think, wow, they don't actually learn anything from these from these social medias and stuff, and because there's no details for them. They're not getting what we used to do in the schools.
No.
Well, luckily I still go to Manchester schools, but I don't know about the rest of the country.
Well, they can choose, the schools can choose, and the parents have a choice and this sort of
So
thing.
I think obviously we were Body Positive works in the sphere of sexual health as well, broadly, and it seems to be a lot of the concerns are around contraception, which of course if people are on contraception with the implant or whatever, they're still not protected from other STIs. I think that's very much the message is disconnected in that way, is that, oh well, I'm on the implant, or I'm on I've got the coil or whatever, rather than obviously a lot of the message is condoms. And I think Colin, what about the message about taking responsibility and control of your own sexual health? Not if you're a positive person, but if you are sexually active and you're having a number of partners.
I think it's about self-empowerment, and it's about being able to respect yourself and your partners, but being able to make that choice in a relationship where, hopefully, as Norma said, you're going to have trust, and you're going to have openness, and you're going to have inclusion. And it requires a level of honesty. But also, one of my concerns is, and we saw this again with COVID, that if we make it such that I become responsible for protecting everybody else, and therefore it isn't about how you behave, you can do what you want. All the pressure is on me to do the right thing. And we saw that with the messaging around COVID. And those messages were, you are responsible for protecting the NHS. You are responsible for whether this virus spreads to other people. And putting that pressure on individuals to assume that mantle for themselves, and knowing that the consequence of my behaviour could bring down the NHS, and what that does to someone's mental health, is so impactful. And that's what was happening around certainly gay men and their sexual behaviour. You have to have a very strong spirit to be able to take that personal responsibility. But also, if you find out that you're positive, to be able to get your head round that, to embrace that, and then be able to determine how you're going to share that with other people. And I used to do training courses, particularly around fostering and adoption. And one of the questions that always came up is, we deserve to know, we deserve to be told. And this was whether someone was having, an overnight stay. We deserve to be told. And when you asked those individuals, if you were positive, what are the things that you would need to have in place in order to feel secure and safe? The first thing was confidentiality. So if it was you living with HIV, you would want to have the capacity to make the choice about who you told. Mm. But if you were in contact with someone else, you have a right. They are obligated to tell you about their status. And so that disconnect between what happens if it's you living with a condition, or you making choices for yourself, and how you empower yourself to do that and be in control of that. And that's the thing, Sally, it's about to be in control and to make the choice. But still, the forces that are out there are about saying, no, that choice isn't yours. You will be forced to do something, regardless of the impact that has on you. You will be forced to do that. And we have to empower. We have to educate. We have to give people a sense of their true selves in order to live an authentic life and be their best possible person. But that requires support and sustenance, rather than just saying we're making it your responsibility and hang no matter how you do that.
Yeah, and fun. There's not much fun in life. And if we worry about every little thing that we're doing, anything. Or even, you know, we have a chance to have sex, that would be great.
Not at work.
You know, so that is the other aspect that people did bring into it. I mean, I was, you know, a palliative care nurse. I worked within, you know, I supported 100 people dying at home. And then also worked as a Macmillan with cancer patients. And, you know, sort of a lot of the time, you know, within the HIV field, you were just laughing, you know, like laughing a lot, you know, whereas within the cancer field, it's just, oh no, my life's been ruined and I'd worked so hard and now this. Whereas, you know, people actually learn to live, you know, live life to the full within, you know, because they were in a supportive situation and it wasn't all doom and gloom, although it was doom and gloom.
Yes.
You know, I kind of, actually, you know, I mean, I remember, I'll just tell you this one story about this guy who was called Miss America. And he was a real out there guy. And he was dying, and I was caring for him. And I used to go and give him his medication. So I'd put IVs up, I'd have to change his catheters and so on at home. And I went in, and he sat there totally naked, virtually nothing left on him, with, you know, catheter hanging out here. And his mates across from him had come over, and he was having the worst time with his relationship and this, that and the other. And he said to Miss America, I shouldn't be burdening you with this, with all your problems. Miss America looks at him and goes, what problems are they? And that was just like, you think, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there is, back to your question about openness and honesty, and about the importance of effective equality, diversity and inclusion programs, because if you're going to reveal your sexual orientation at work, and you're going to reveal your HIV status at work, and you work for a company that has bases across the world, that has implications. That has consequences. So you need to know that your employer has robust and supportive policies and practices in place so that your honesty does not affect your employment status, does not affect or discriminate against you being able to do the same job as anyone else in that company. And we still live in a world where to divulge your sexual orientation or divulge your HIV status means that there are certain countries where you will not be allowed to enter that country if it's known, or you run the risk of being killed if it's known. And those are the realities. So it has to be thorough from the top to the bottom within an organisation to truly live what equality, diversity and inclusion means for all your employees and for all the users of your services. Otherwise, people run risks.
What happened in my workplace, I hope and pray to God every day never happens to anybody else. But it happened, and I've had to overcome that, and without the services I wouldn't have done that. But when I came out on social media, there are people who I've worked with, dated, slept with, who are on my social media, saw it on my Instagram and were like, oh my gosh. And out of all the people, to this day, I hope this is good because I'm touching it and praying, I haven't had a negative comeback yet. 5 of my previous partners have come back to me and said, oh my God, Anita, now I know why when we ran out of condoms we have to do other things. I'm like, oh, no condoms left, I just have to do other things now. And laughed But you've now made me look and gone, oh my God, but I'm still being naughty outside of my relationship and I'm not using condoms. And I was like, oh my gosh. So out of the 5 guys that have contacted me, I've took 3 of them back to the clinic and supported them going through, not because they were scared of what I had, but what the life they were living, and it made them go, oh my gosh. So the way I look at it is, I had to do the social media thing because what had happened in my workplace had dirtied my soul to the point of I didn't want to be alive, and I had to take my status back. I had to say, this is my status, and you are never going to beat me up with it again. And now I own it, and if people want to say things, I go, and that's so old news. But not many people have the strength to do that.
And also, going back to some of those early years, and the impact that HIV has on families. Norma particularly worked with a family where their one dream was to go to Disney World. And we managed to get the funding to get them to Disney World. But what then went alongside it was a whole team of people arranging to make certain that the medications that they needed to take weren't in their suitcases. Yes. So we had to arrange for the medications to be sent and picked up and available to them in America, so that when they got through customs and through immigration, that they weren't sent immediately home. And those logistics of planning so that this family could live their dream took a whole team of people to organise and arrange. But when they got back, the bounce for them, the impact of that was enormous, and people like Norma and others were working hard to make people's dreams come true before the inevitable death hit them. And so, you did see and experience some wonderful things along the way. And to share in those experiences and that whole life was part and parcel of what you did. But it also meant that you went to funerals where, there were balloons and there were parties and there was cake and, you'd see the curtains close over the coffin, and then this Diamante gloved hand would come to wave people goodbye. And then you'd go to a funeral for someone who died for something else, and it was the doom and gloom. And we knew this person when they were alive, and now they're gone. And it was, it's like, what is this? This is a funeral? It's like, I'd not been to those
sad ones.
For a long time.
We used Darien House as a children's hospice near us in Preston. And I'm smiling like it was, but they were just the most amazing people. And like you just said, it was just joyous. Like you go in and you don't think you're surrounded by kids that are dying. And my son was one of the first children that they took with HIV. Well, he had AIDS. And 3 times we went to Darien House. Obviously, we'd made good stuff as Binnsies. And we were waiting for him to die. And one particular time, because they normally closed over Christmas, and he just went, we took him to Lapland, and but it was like, we were there for 3 days, and on the last day, he just dropped. And I was like, oh my God, please don't die before we get home. Please don't die before we get home.
And took insurance.
Yeah, no, we never had insurance. There was no such. I've never had insurance on holidays. I'm saying this on camera, sorry. I don't think I could get it or afford it either. But we literally got back from Lapland, and I'm thinking, and luckily, because he used to wear lace cap things all the time, they thought he had cancer. So I was letting them live that little dream, because I thought, I ain't telling him it's HIV, they'll stop picking him up. And we got back from Lapland, and we literally got to the hospital, and they went, Ecne, Anita, and I was like, oh my God. So they rang Darien House, and they reopened it. And we were all there for like these 3 days waiting for him to die. And then all of a sudden, and he was just, there was nothing left of him. And he was like 7, he just lifted his head, and he was like, are we going to eat today? And I was like, are you joking me? I am sat here broken and you just want to eat. And then 2 days later, he's running around, and I'm like, fucking. And you're just like, it's bizarre, but these people, and if without them people that did all them things for us, I mean, it just was devastating. And then when he was 13, we had this massive big party in the club, and the nurses from the children's ward come, and the people from Downing House, and we're all there having a few glasses of wine, laughing, going, this is just surreal. Because we never thought we would get here, you know. At 5.5, we never thought he'd see 6. And now we're celebrating him being 13. It was just amazing.
Amazing. So if we can sort of final thoughts really on where do you think we are now, and where should we go? What is our direction of travel? Because now, you know, HIV is seen as just another STI in lots of cases, but there's still obviously the stigma there. So we've got the targets, we've got the UN targets, you know, to no new diagnosis by 2030. What do you think are the next stages for HIV? Anita?
For me, I just think we need to put more into the resources. We need to be more informative. In 1995, when I first started doing talks as a positive speaker, we were doing first and third year nursing students, we were doing midwives, we were talking to doctors, we were re-educating, you know, like in any job you have to re-educate, you have to do something. We don't do that anymore. They don't talk to us, they don't know about us until we're there on their ward or we're in their workplace, and then it's like, oh my God. Because once again, we go back to the tombstone, that's all everyone remembers, is the negativeness. They don't realise that there are amazing people like me walking with them, and we have got HIV. Yeah. And for me, that's what has to change. We have to stop having black and gay people, nothing against my black ladies before you all come back at me. My sisters at George House would be like, Anita, and I'd be like, I know, I'm just saying. But we need to stop having it as black and gay people. It should be people like me or heterosexual males. And the reason why you don't have people like me, well, you have me, is because of stigma and fear. They want to be able to walk this world without having bricks thrown at them, without having horrible words said to them. And that's what's got to change.
Yeah. Norma?
Well, I think first of all we need a vaccine, you know, sort of, because I still think that the drug companies could have produced vaccines. I mean, we saw that with COVID, but they make more money out of the medication, so why should they? So I think we need a vaccine, but I think the UN World AIDS Day demand this year is community-led. And that's where we need to go back to. We've become medically led, we've become governmentally led or whatever. And it's the communities that actually can get out there and know what to talk about, know how to educate people, know how, you know, what's needed. So I think we follow the UN's World AIDS Day. Let's get community-led. Vaccine and community-led, that's my way forward.
Colin?
Yes to what's been said so far, but also, firstly, we've all now lived through a pandemic. And we've all experienced how that pandemic affected us individually and in terms of our mental health and our sense of community and belonging. So you all know what it's like to be told it's your responsibility to save other people's lives and to protect the system on your shoulders. So you know what it's like for someone with HIV to be given exactly those same pressures. We do now have an opportunity to treat people living with HIV. And as someone who's been around for a long time, the number of people I know who say, I'm negative, who've actually never been tested. So tests are out there. I do think knowing your status because of the treatments that are available is important, because it does mean that your infection can be controlled and you can live a very healthy life. Less so about the impact on other people, but this is something that can affect you, which was very different to when testing was first introduced. And also, there are opportunities that if you want, you can take PrEP. If you live the kind of lifestyle where perhaps the choices that you're making are ones where risky sex is part of who you are, but all the people I talk to don't think about having risky sex. They think about having fun, and they think about having a good time, you know. I'm not going into this because, you know, kind of, there's a possibility that, you know, it'll be something like, I'm a celebrity, get me out of here with a jungle trial. It's about having fun. So if you can do that and do that more safely and protect yourself and through that protect others, that's an opportunity that's there for you. But I also think that there is something about us as a society taking responsibility for saying, don't leave it all on the shoulders of people with HIV. Governmentally, organisationally, socially, we are responsible for how we treat people. And that's the message that we can get from community as well, is we're all responsible for how we treat people, with compassion, with truth, and with support.
And we saw the communities come together around COVID. You know, like kind of they did a lot more. So it's not impossible to actually widen that community.
Exactly.
But banging a tin on your doorstep won't protect you from HIV or COVID. So, you know, there are banging a tin on your doorstep.
No, but you could feed people.
You could.
Okay, that's great. So I think just to summarise, we're saying going forward, it's take personal responsibility, educate yourself, find out, break the fear of HIV basically, because that's what causes stigma and prejudice. And also talk about sex, talk about what it actually involves. Don't be shy to do that and have fun. You know, that's part of life, and we can all take responsibility for our own health and not leave it on the shoulders of others. So that's it for this World AIDS Day. I'd like to thank Colin, Anita and Norma for their moving and valuable contributions, and have a good day. Thank you.